I'd now like to introduce our next two speakers, Paul Henman, who's Professor for Digital Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Queensland, and Daniel Turner, Senior Solicitor at the Welfare Rights Centre in New South Wales. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leanne.
Just unmute, Daniel.
Yeah, okay, I'm unmuted now. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all enjoying the conference so far. I'm coming to you today from the Northern Rivers, from the lands of the Bundjalung people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge that the land was never ceded. This morning, Paul will be the expert on this very interesting subject of automation, drawing on his years of experience of research in social policy. Paul, did you want to say any quick introductory remarks before I begin?
Thanks, Daniel. I want to acknowledge that I'm in Turrbal and Jagera country in Brisbane area, and it's a bit welcome. It's wonderful to be here to talking to the Economic Justice Australia at this conference and talking about really important issues of technology and its intersection with social security operations and payments. So I think what we're having is a bit of a dialogue between Daniel and I, so that's how we're going to operate.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun and freewheeling discussion, and feel free to put some questions in the question and answer section, and we can address those as we go along. So, you know, I guess just giving my background, I've been a social security lawyer for the past 4 years in this particular space, and working as a lawyer in different fields prior to that. And really, this question of automation, artificial intelligence, whatever you want to brand it, has really come up in the context of Robodebt. You know, looking at this space raises a great deal of issues, and reading some of Paul's work, Robodebt's really just an example of something much broader that we're seeing in a range of different contexts. And I think, Paul, it'd be great to actually start with a definition of automation and AI, but actually a concept that you coined, digital social policy, which is a fantastic umbrella term to encompass, you know, what automated decision making in Robodebt is really just a little bit of a part of. And I wonder if you could speak to that to start with.
Thanks, Daniel. I guess for me, digital social policy is really about the way in which digital technology is being used in the delivery, the operations, and the designing of social policy systems. Virginia Eubanks actually talks about the digital poorhouse, picking up on the idea of the classic British poorhouse as a place of containment and surveillance, and sees very much continuation of the ways in which digital technology is being used today. Whilst the last few years has really seen an interest in digital technology in policy, partly because of Robodebt, but also because of the big discussion about artificial intelligence. Digital technology has been around in our social security system for 50 years. We actually started introducing computers into our social security system in the 70s or the late 60s, and it's progressively become front and centre of our operations. Now, Robodebt is actually a very simple computer system. I think that Leanne referred to that in her discussions with the minister. But so often people get fixated with the new whiz-bang technology, what we might call artificial intelligence. But for me, what's really important is the way in which automation is used, for what type of purposes and what decisions that are made. And so as part of the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making in Society, we tend to focus on what types of decisions are made with either with or instead of humans, rather than the specific technology. But if you want to distinguish between artificial intelligence, often that is a marketing term to mean machine learning. And machine learning is a way in which an algorithm is taught a type of practice, taught to identify things. So think about the facial recognition system. A traditional approach to facial recognition system from a computer scientist perspective is to say, how am I going to determine whose face this is? So we might start with assumptions about, well, maybe we need to look at the size and structure of the face, the spacing of people's eyes and nose and mouth, and we design a system around that. And that's how we computer scientists use a rational, logical break down the problem into what they understand. And then they code that. Machine learning starts the opposite way. It starts with a view that, well, we don't know how to focus on this. What we'll do is we'll give all of these images of faces and things like that, and then map different faces with different people. And the computer then learns, just categorizes and sees what the differences are. It learns in an unstructured way to identify what might be some of the features of faces are. And that's just unsupervised machine learning. But there's also supervised machine learning. So, for example, you can feed in, just taking the case of overpayments in the social security system, as you go, well, here's all the people who are in the social security system, and these are the people who've had overpayments, and these are the people who have not have overpayments. And the machine learning algorithm will actually learn what is the kind of look or the characteristics that is associated with an overpayment and what is not. So it doesn't require any thought from a welfare rights lawyer or a social security recipient or anything to think about what is an overpayment, what leads to overpayments. It's just the data that's trying to tell it. And there's lots of problems with that. But I think being aware that digital technology is infused within social security, but it's more not the sophistication of the technology is important, but how it's being used. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. Made some great points there. And I guess those are examples about, the power of digital technologies. You've made the point that it's been a part of the system for 50 years or so. At the moment, how are digital technologies being employed in a social security context?
Well, when we look at our system, obviously some of the key things that are happening is very much like automating payments. So we just had that discussion about payments in with the in-June card, etc. So money into people's bank accounts. We have the assessment of whether people are eligible to receive a benefit and what the level of payment is. And so we have a new system called the rates and benefits calculator that's been rewritten at the moment as part of the welfare platform. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but about part of the fundamental restructure of the social security computer system. But apart from that, we also have data flows, which again was very much part of the the data flows, the data match between tax office and the social security system. For example, also getting data from the visa system from Department of Homeland Security, Home Affairs, to try to identify whether information is held to support people's, whether they're on the right visa or not. We've also seen increasingly use of chatbots in our social security system and Services Australia to help people navigate. And we're also seeing facial recognition systems used under emergency legislation to identify people who are applying for disaster relief after the bushfires in 2019. So there's
wow, it's new to me. I was completely unaware of that. Wow.
Yeah, so there's a range of ways in which technology is being used, and it's really front and center. It really is the bulk of what is happening in the system.
Great. Look, it's I think it raises a question of how is it being used? What thought process around? We've got all these technologies. We've got all these tools in different ways about how we can use them, but decisions are being made leading to particular types of systems. So cashless debit card is, I guess, a potential that was made available through technology. And that's kind of one application in the context of the social security system. We're also seeing an application where we've got this data matching, which enables a Robodebt type system to come up. So we're seeing systems that are not necessarily from the social security recipients' perspectives necessarily the most helpful or useful, or perhaps what they would prefer are those technologies to be used for. So what is the sort of logic? What are the values driving the implementation of these systems or types of systems in social security, if that question makes sense?
Yeah, I think first of all, we have to understand that the way in which technology is being designed is very much within a social and political context. It's first of all, it's obviously practical in the sense the government says this is the policy, this is we need to deliver these benefits, whether it's the COVID supplement, etc. And obviously computer systems are there to do that. But it's also built within that broader context and saying, okay, well, we're going to be cracked down on fraud or cracked down on overpayments. So that becomes the way in which it determines what's be used. So we can have different values and social political values. For example, in South Korea, they have a system that's been put in place called blind spots, which is actually being used to identify people who aren't receiving benefits, who are entitled, to try to ensure that they receive the benefits they can have. They should be receiving. And this was actually introduced in the light of a public scandal where a number of people from a family suicided because they just did not have money to live. And so these political values are really...
I couldn't imagine that system. I couldn't imagine that happening in Australia, that the governments would be looking for people, identifying people who they can, support. It seems that our systems are not geared that way.
Well, it says something about our social political values, but early on when they introduced the data matching program in the 80s and 90s, the then Hawke Keating government actually used the data matching to identify people who could be eligible for family tax payment, but it wasn't tax payment then, but family allowance, and actually send out invitations to do that. So we have done it in the past, but I'm not aware of us doing it in the more recent past. But the other values that underpin how computers are being used is very much like, this is seen as very much a technical exercise rather than a policy exercise. And so what we also have is, like, social security lawyers, about what a decision is in the Social Security Act. But there are a lot of decisions that being made that are not covered under the Social Security Act. There are a lot of things like whether you remember where you put into the job seeker classification index, which types of people are looked for or have greater scrutiny for compliance with possible overpayment. So there are a lot of decisions that are happening that underpin, that are seen as technical exercise or driven by administration, that where technologists or computer system operators develop. And so some of the values that are opinion are from computer science people. I want to tell you a little story. When I actually had a chat a few years ago with one of the senior members of the Chief Information Officer of Canada, and they were thinking about how do we create a more seamless process of sharing of information. And they said, look, just imagine if we had a child that was born in one province, that information at the hospital is registered and it flows through the whole system from the local to the municipality to the provincial government through the federal government, and it automatically starts child benefit, it starts registration processes to childcare, etc. And I said, oh, that's great, that's wonderful. But what happens if someone at one stage makes an allegation or puts in some data that their child is being abused or neglected? And it turns out that was wrong. How do we undo all of these automated flows? In the computer side, this person from the Chief Information Officer said, oh, I hadn't thought of that. And this is one of the problems with that computer scientists think, if only we get the system designed right, it will be perfect. And that's also a bureaucratic's dream. but it
Yep.
doesn't deal with the values of the real lived experiences. So I remember when I did my PhD, the people in Department of Social Security then talked about the three-legged widow as a way in which to try to say, okay, how does this work for the people who are actually not the white, middle-class, educated people? How does it work for those who are not fit those boxes? And so we need to start thinking about what it means for the lived experience. And I think this is where we need to start looking at how do we design computers and use digital technology from outside as well as for organisational purposes. That obviously governments are doing it, but the governments can do better, like giving better documents that says we've made a change to your payment, and go, well, why did you make a change to the payment, etc., like that. Just like Robodebt, how did you calculate this debt? They can do a lot better job with that. But we can also think about how do we actually use digital tech to help empower people who are using the social security system. So things like creating a wiki where the experts of social security, that is the people who've been beneficiaries for many years, they know how to navigate the system. They share their expertise, and so other people can use that. The Australian Unemployed Workers Union have created an app where you can actually go and find out where your local job search provider is and rate it and say, we've had a 5-star experience with this, or I've had a 1-star experience. And so providing further information to people so that they can know what to navigate, what to look out for, etc. So there's a range of ways in which we can start to do this. We can also, governments could start to do something, basic things like pre-filling information into, just like we do with the tax system. That would help reduce the need for hard copies of originals for identification purpose, which is what government operates. We can provide access to the digital technology that's being used to make payments. We don't provide that at the moment. So at what we call an application programming interface, where people like welfare rights could actually go, okay, this is the context of the person. What payment do you think they should be? What payment level should they be receiving? And we could use that rather than trying to do it independently. The federal government in the 90s tried to investigate ways in which to provide more joined up sharing of information and referral processes between Centrelink and social welfare organisations. So we can start to think about, well, how do we provide a duty of care when someone walks into a Centrelink office and says, oh, let's go down to the salvos down there. How do we provide a duty of care to help them know that information that the salvos need to know that you're on a Centrelink benefit, that they've got that, those type of things. You can think about it in single application portal rather than saying, I'm going to apply for to see DSP and get rejected and go, well, can't get anything now. Rather having a single application portal rather. So there are range. And the other thing is like Domino's, when you have put in your pizza, it tells you whether you're receiving the order, it's cooking now, it's out on delivery. You can do something like that to say, well, where is my benefit application in the program, in the queue? Where is it happening? What stage is it at? When am I likely to hear from it? So a lot of things that governments can do with digital tech that are not very sophisticated, but can greatly improve the experience that people have.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So there's a lot in what you've just said. You've covered quite a wide a field there and touching on the use of particular technologies and could really improve substantially the social security system for the users of that system. I guess my next question is around the question of accountability, because you've raised some really important points, and that is that the values of the designers of these systems are implicit in the design, and how it's designed, who's involved in that design is a really critical piece. So can you talk to that a little further?
Yeah,
So I guess the questions are, what's the ideal for a design when you're thinking about implementing some sort of technology in the social security space, and And also, how do we check for those biases and review the systems from that perspective? Do we have the systems that are robust enough to, even at that early stage, to ensure the design of these systems is really appropriate?
Thanks, Daniel. That's a really important question, because obviously the design is driven very much by the legislation and what it has to do, but also pressures from the industry, computers industry, saying, let's try to, this is what we can offer. I think at the big structural level, there are things like, how do we make our system a bit more flexible to be able to respond to needs? And I have to say that the Australian social security system is far better than the UK and a lot of other systems. For example, it has been revealed that not the treasurer, but equivalent to the treasurer, wanted to increase COVID payments during COVID, but their system under the universal benefit computer system didn't allow them to do it, to create that level of flexibility. They can only update their software once a year or once every 2 years. And so, and the universal credit in the UK was very difficult to get off because they've had fundamentally the wrong computer system. So we actually have a better system to be more flexible. But ultimately,
although I would just say, just anecdotally, that the system, both from the perspective of Centrelink officers using it, seems to be quite and you know, the outputs of that system, the sort of ridiculous and absurd issues that arise. For example, someone's eligible for a payment, but Centrelink can't even use their computer system to pay that person because there is some bug sitting somewhere in the system, which no one can work out, and requires, you know, I had a person off payment for 6 months because there was a bug in the computer system. Are our computer systems for the social security system really that, you know, robust and flexible?
Well, in terms of the way in which we set up our databases, we can do that. Like, we're able to do a COVID payment pretty quickly. I mean, we have those things. So what I'm saying is, comparatively to other countries, certainly the bugs and what priorities of bugs are really important, or says something about what the priorities of systems are. But I think going back to that question about the values and how do we look at it, so a lot of the things is that, as I said before, there's a subterranean aspect of policy that doesn't that is underneath the formal policy that is then computerized, and that's where a lot of the things are, where it's not informed by lawyers, it's not informed by legislation, and it's informed by the designers. And I think this is where we see in a lot of computer science and designing, there's a mismatch. The government has actually instituted a digital protections framework for helping making sure our new employment service model, digital technology system, is accountable, transparent, complies with human rights. But that's only for social security decisions under the Act. For a lot of other things that the technology does, is not covered under those decisions. And the designers don't actually have thought about what it might mean to have a design that is biased. For example, saying someone didn't meet their employment responsibilities because they were celebrating their religious day, or they were on sorry business for Indigenous purposes, could be seen as racially or ethnically discriminatory. Yet they haven't actually thought about that, and that's quite common. And so we really need to have more co-design. We have to have far more education and connection between what is the legal requirements, but also how do we design a system that is transparent and accountable and ethical from the ground up. So co-design is an important part of that.
Do we have co-design processes in Australia when these technologies are implemented? Have you seen examples of that? Because no. Okay. All right. Wow. It's extraordinary. I know you've been doing
not at a government level, at a serious government level, because a lot of things is that governments tend to do that insular in their own systems, and then they release them out. That's their pattern.
Yep.
I mean, we had Nadia, which was the chatbot that was designed for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. I didn't eventuate because of technical difficulties, but it went through a co-design process with advocates and representatives of the disability community. So that was a good example of an approach that was open to co-design. So there are occasional examples. I guess going back to that question about those questions about values and accountability also speaks to the administrative justice. And so how do we actually have administrative justice process? And I think reflecting on Robodebt is a really important one, because Robodebt basically occurred after the government had a class action. It stopped it after a class action. Now, this speaks to the problem that we have in our administrative law situation, is that a decision by a computer is fundamentally different to a decision by a human. When I, as a human, make a decision, I'm putting my mind to the circumstances of this person, and I'm considering this particular application as itself. When a computer is making a decision, it's applying its rules to this particular case, and it's going to apply these rules to a case that looks very much like it. And so its decisions are systemic rather than individual, yet our appeal processes are based on individual decisions, not systemic decisions. So we actually fundamentally don't have a way, and I'm not aware of anywhere in the rest of the world that is able to actually appeal the computer as a systemic decision maker. And that's something that we really need to explore more creatively about how we do that. And administrative justice also requires a level of transparency. And I think welfare rights lawyers know far better than me how difficult it is to navigate client information and to make sense of client information, and how to understand how decisions were made. And so there's no reason why with digital technology we could actually make it much more easy to navigate and for people to understand or the benefit decisions that are made, how a debt overpayment was calculated, etc., like that. It's just that there's no political administrative will to do so. So we need to be able to advance those capabilities to do it.
Just on that point, I mean, an example of, you touched on an example that we encounter on a frequent basis in relation to debts, where people are seeking explanations of a decision, a social security decision, in relation to a debt. The thing about debts is that they involve the application of the income test and a range of other eligibility and qualification criteria that involved. Unfortunately, the system as it stands, and I'm sure people who have had a debt before and have sought to do something about it, the transparency of that decision is virtually it's not there. If you request information from Centrelink in relation to a debt, you get a computer dump. Terry Carney was referring to the computer dump, which is precisely what people get in relation to their calculation. So there's a really critical, and I think an urgent issue of reform in relation to transparency about debts, but it goes across the board in relation to a lot of decisions. Decisions are complex under the Social Security Act because it's a very, very targeted system. But it's critical to administrative justice, to people getting the right benefits, whether they have to go through appeals processes to get that. They need to understand the decision in the first place, not just you're not eligible, but why. And the systems as they're currently designed are not really adapted to explaining the decision, what are the steps in it. And speaking to you and listening to your comments, absolutely, it could be done a lot better. I can imagine myself ways in which the decision-making process and the communication of the decision-making process could be improved significantly. And I'm sure people who are here today on the line who may in fact be receiving a Social Security payment could add to that. Sorry, Paul, I just throw in that sort of anecdote there. My experience is a great frustration that we have, and that people have when they have debts and can't get basic information about it. I'm wondering if we could interject with a couple of questions at this point, perhaps, Paul.
Sure.
Would you like to answer questions yourselves, or would you like me to go through the questions?
Do you want to just read out some of the questions and perhaps we could address those?
Sure, but I'm going to use my privilege here to jump in with the first question. Something I've been thinking about a lot over
Great.
over the last while, as I've learned more about this, is this idea of skills atrophy or skills degradation. And I've been guilty in the past of putting into Economic Justice Australia's submissions that a recommendation is that you must have a human in the loop to check any kind of calculations or decisions being made. But as I learn more about this, I'm understanding that the more you automate the system, the less the humans actually know about the process. And
it's like it's like using Google Maps to find anything these days. I have no idea how to navigate anymore if I don't have my app. You know, I can't read a map. There's so much that I cannot do because I'm relying on technology.
And caseworkers see this all the time, that we ring what is meant to be the expert debt line, and the person at Centrelink, no fault of their own, the call centre worker, only has the screens with a few bits of information. They don't know how the debt was calculated either, and they can't explain to the person, what actually happened that made the debt appear. So my question is how we get that balance right of keeping efficiency in the system, but also having sufficient resourcing at Centrelink so that you do have the expertise to provide that real check on decisions to make sure that they're fair and accurate and legal.
It's a good question.
It is really important question too. And that process by which if we automate things, then we de-skill the people who use it is widespread. Braverman wrote about this in the 1970s. And we see this process of de-skilling in a whole range of areas. I've got a colleague here at the University of Queensland, Philip Gillingham, who's looked at the use of decision support systems in child protection and has found that he's interviewed people, both skilled long-term practitioners in child protection, and they will look at the system and go, well, I know what this case should be, what risk to rate it. So I will put in the data to get the system to make the decision that I believe is the appropriate decision. Whereas new practitioners will come in and they go, well, I'm not very skilled. The computer knows more than me. I'll just put in the thing. And so they actually then rely on the computer. The computer says no, style. And the problem is that the more we bring that in, not only to the people who practitioners, but governments and or the organisations saying, we don't need to pay these people at high skill rates. We can actually pay people at a lower skill because they're actually not needing to do anything. Now, there is an element in this dynamic of these skilling. There's also an upskilling of a very few people that have to deal with senior review appeal officers internally have to go, okay, we need some people who actually know the material. So you do need to still have those senior officers and invest in a group of people that have that expertise in there. But the incentives very much, structural incentives are very much to reduce, automate. And so that also means that we need to make sure that there's a lot of checks and balances, both internal and external, to the systems we design. And that's why we can't just rely on government to say, oh, this system is correct. We also have to rely on external accountability. And we really need to look seriously at the way in which digital technology can be used in a way to enhance that external accountability. And that is really important to do. I don't know if that is a question.
It's interesting, and it just made me think of an example that a colleague that I work with, the Welfare Rights Centre, currently policy officer with Economic Justice Australia, has extensive experience in social security and working for Centrelink. And she used to tell me that back in the day, 20 years ago, before a debt was raised, the individual have to write a report to support the debt. So go through a detailed consideration of whether or not this debt is valid. These days, that process is extremely truncated. It also meant in having to write that report that they were extremely expert in what they were doing. And at the end of the day, I very much doubt there would be many appeals arising from those decisions, because the original decision was such a quality one in the first place. So I'm not so confident that the way in which technology is being employed is necessarily having a great or positive impact in the social security space. Of course, it does in many different ways. It makes decisions, simple decisions like calculating a person's rate of payment, much more efficient, meaning a lot more people can get a decision very quickly, and that's of course very welcome. But there's a lot we need to be mindful of in terms of automation and the
Yeah, I think
use of technology in this particular space.
Yeah, and this is a key thing that I think that I didn't touch on, is that there is an element of judgment in some of these things. Like, as you mentioned just then, Daniel, is if they
Yes,
receiving this income, then this is the amount that you get paid, right? That's pretty straightforward, black and white calculation. And computers will do well at that, but computers don't do well when you're making a human judgment about things. And we can increasingly use computers to help with that process, like thinking about the marriage-like relationship, which is a very much a judgment type of approach. We all now have codified that more and more in legislation, and you can go, okay, these are the things we need to consider. But ultimately, the computers can help those prompts, but it can't really make that decision. And that's when a lot of people talk about making sure that there's a human in the loop decision making. When is human in the loop decision making needed? And that's the questions that often we don't deal with. But that's where the computer scientists say, oh, we can actually automate this. And the question is, well, should we be automating those decisions? Things same with disability support pension. Again, there are very difficult decisions that need to be made by informed people, where judgment needs to be made rather than a calculation. And so that's just an important distinction that we need to explore and make sure that human in the loop. I'm not a lawyer, but I understand that in Australia, we actually have quite a mixed outcome in terms of when human in the loop is required. Now, under the Social Security Act, the Secretary has for decades been able to delegate to the computer the ability to make a decision on the Social Security Act, and does millions of times a day. But recently, it went to the High Court, where a tax office, actually the government successfully appealed a decision where a tax office computer sent a debt notice to a taxpayer, and the debt notice was incorrect. The taxpayer said, that's the debt, that the computer said that is the correct amount. Why even though if you think under the law it's incorrect, the computer made this decision, that's the amount I have to pay. The High Court actually said that no, because the human wasn't involved, then that wasn't a correct decision, and so we can change it. And so the High Court had actually said the human has to make a decision, whereas Social Security Act, you've got a lot of people where no humans are making a decision. And we had a similar case in New South Wales in Inland Revenue, where the Act actually said that the human had to be put its to mind to make a decision about a revenue case in New South Wales. And in that case, the digital technology system was overturned because it didn't have any human intervention. So the role of human intervention is a really interesting one, and something that we do need to explore. But also, I think we need to think about designing our systems so we know, well, what parts of our systems should we automate and what parts of our systems shouldn't we automate. And it goes back to that value system that we talked about before, Daniel, is that computer scientists want to be able to automate everything. They think so that's the thing. And it just makes a perfect world. But I think what we should be thinking about is, how do we use our digital technology to work out who are the people who we can make automated decisions based, or what are the cases that we can automate? Because a lot of people want to get up online and apply for family tax benefit online. They don't want to have to go into a Centrelink office. But there are a lot of people who want to go into a Centrelink office and want to actually talk to a person. They're in a crisis. They don't want to get a hop onto a computer system. They want to be supported and talked to and work through what is a difficult situation that they're facing. So we actually think we can start to use computers to actually go, which are the cases we actually would be better off working with and providing, as just like the banks did. The banks don't have people going in anymore, but they're putting their effort into people who want face-to-face encounters, and they're putting that into more quality encounters than you used to when you go up to the till just to get $50 out. So we need to think about, how do we do that in Centrelink? How do we have those face-to-face encounters that are quality encounters for the people who need it, and then we do online for the people who don't need it?
It's a really critical point. Leanne, sorry?
I was just going to say, speaking of the things that we should automate, the next question is from Catherine Boyle from Welfare Rights Centre. Do you see any issues with the introduction of the single touch payroll? It does have the potential to eliminate confusion and debts for people struggling to report their fluctuating income, but could there be unintended consequences?
Look, I'll say yes, there are always that unintended consequences. Look, I can see there are benefits, because just, the system better than mine. People don't necessarily know the difference between taxable income and their take-home income, and probably report the wrong version of their income. And the reporting may not be on time. I think the problem is, like that example from Canada that I talked about, is we assume the system was working perfectly and don't think about, well, when does the system not work? So, for example, an employer, the connection between an employer and the government system drops down, the income is not reported accurately or on time. What's the consequence of those things? So what happens when an employer is actually avoiding paying tax or superannuation, or manipulating what it's actually paying? So we've had all of those cases with underpaid wages. So employer could be reporting a wage that they say you're paying, but not paying it. So there are ways in which we need to start to think about, when might the data be wrong, or this is the whole problem, is that we kind of think that the process of collecting data is not non-problematic. It isn't unproblematic. There is problems that occur, and what the computer says and what the real world is can often two different things. And so we actually need to make sure that the process in place that reflect the real world have there's checks to make sure that they are accurate. So it goes back to transparency. So make sure the client can see what's being reported, rather than saying, oh, you've had the data reported. Make sure that they can see and check, if they want to, that's what has been reported, and they go, yeah, that's the right amount. So those kind of things, I think, can be greatly beneficial, but we'd actually need to be alert to the possibility that there may be problems, and design around those, or making checks that are for those problems.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important point about the inputs into the system. If the employer is doing something dodgy, if the report from the employer is incorrect, the problem with these systems is a person sees data, and there's this tendency, I think, amongst humans to just assume that data is correct. And if a person sees this data, there's a strong tendency to just go, yes, that's correct, and not really engage with it. So I guess the expectation is, once you see this data, you're going to pull up your payslip, you're going to check it, you're going to think about, well, how many hours of I worked? Is this employment? Is this income correct? I don't know that a person's necessarily going to gauge a lot at that point where they see that income that's being reported closely. And if they don't engage closely, it's a potential debt and overpayment problem. And then trying to wind that back is going to be extremely difficult, particularly if they've confirm that the employment income is correct. So, you know, build it into this system, there really needs to be a very clear communication and awareness that when you're looking at your income as reported over to Centrelink, you really need to critically engage or think about that. And when you're clicking yes, you need to read the terms and conditions. You know, we often sign documents without reading terms and conditions, and I can imagine a similar process going. Yes, I need my payment. Nothing's changed as far as I'm aware. You know, the employer's recorded. I'm sure it's correct. I'll confirm that it's correct. That process, down the track, I'm sure we'll see problems arising from that.
I think that's also where designers come in, and that's where I think the missing link in all of this is that designers that are alert to the lived experience of people, that can communicate between the systems developers and the lived experience of people in the co-design process. That becomes totally invaluable.
Thank you. We have another question now. We've considered debt, but what about the new points-based system for mutual obligation and the fact that people need to meet those required points to get paid? What problems do you see with the automation of that?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I think obviously the policy about what points are available for particular things is a problem in itself, and I don't want to talk about that because that's more of a policy decision about what our activity should be allocated, what amount of points. But in terms of the points-based reporting process, obviously there is like providing evidence that people have. We're talking about the evidence of what they've done is important. But when you record things, so for example, if you had an appointment with your job provider, or you had an interview that you didn't attend, legislation, and now I'm going to be, you can all correct me because you know more about it than me, is allows for certain types of circumstances when you can be devoid of not have that. And what I mentioned before is like, well, if that appointment was made at a time like on Eid, for example, when you as a Muslim celebrating Eid, just as Christians might celebrate Christmas, you go, that's not a time, or on a Saturday for someone who's Jewish going, I can't do that because that's the Sabbath, or I'm a sorry business. If there's no drop down box, that goes back to the design of the system that justifies, if there's no drop down box that says this is my circumstance and this is a legitimate reason, how does the computer deal with that? And either the person has to lie or just redefine their circumstances in another one, in which case that they could get questioned for fraud, or they just don't have the box. And so that automation of that process, the design of the system that says my lived experience does not connect to that reporting thing, I think that's the biggest problem. And I don't know whether there's enough behind the scenes checking, because I think if you said other, you can have an other box and type that in. What happens when you put that in? Is there someone that's going to check that? So I think this is one of the biggest problems that have. There's also problems, as the Australian Unemployed Workers Union have identified, is people who've got a smartphone that's not, that's too old. The app doesn't work. What happens if they don't have data? I've got a colleague in the Centre of Excellence that I'm part of, that Daniel Featherstone, who's doing research funded by Telstra to look at digital inclusion and exclusion in remote Indigenous communities. We know that Indigenous communities, where their access to the internet can go down for 3 days. We know that the phone that they own or someone has doesn't necessarily belong to them. It's used by multiple people. So there's a lot of assumptions that are built in to these ways in which we work that can break down without that. And for example, someone with English as a second language, if the interface isn't made in a way that is appropriate for them, then we create problems. And the automation of these problems makes them more severe, There was a case in the US of a man who was actually sacked by a computer, and the whole process of sacking him, we found out, oh no, it's wrong. But the whole organization could not actually stop the sacking process. They had to wait for the whole process to go through and then re-employ him, even though everyone knew that it was a problem. But the computer, once it started the process, it couldn't stop. And that had implications for him. So this is the problem. We need to really know, well, what are where the stop breaks, just like press the stop button and say, how can we stop this? How do we intervene?
Stopping that chain reaction.
That's right.
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry, I just got a text from Mr. Shorten's office, so I was just a bit distracted for a moment. But we'll ask one more question and then we'll get ready for the Minister to join us.
Great, thank you.
Bridget McDermott has the last question. I like this idea of a new mechanism to appeal computer decisions. Any ideas on how this could possibly work or how that might look?
To appeal the structural decision. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, how would this new legal mechanism for appealing computer automated decisions look?
I can't, as a non-lawyer, I don't know. I really don't know. But I think I'm just wondering, like, can you have like the way in which the environment can have standing? I'm wondering to what computer have standing in the opposite sense, that you can actually challenge the computer.
Yeah, I mean, it's a systemic, it does not fit our legal system where you need an individual, you need standing, and you need a decision by a decision maker. And, you know, under our merits review system, it's a decision itself that we're looking at. We're not looking at the background processes, like how that system actually works. You can't get at that. Similarly with Robodebt, you had to appeal a decision in the federal court. The decision itself was irrational, therefore set aside, but nothing about the system was able to be looked at within that process. It's irrelevant from a legal perspective. So it's really only from a strictly litigation perspective, you can't get at it. So it's really in the design phase that is really critical in the design of these systems, but also fortunately, we've got it announced in a Royal Commission. It's in those processes after the fact where you can trawl over, you know, the ashes in this case to work out what went wrong. But it's an interesting question. I think it really comes down to design, and I'm not sure that there's going to be a suitable legal mechanism to appropriately and adequately address the design of a computer system or an algorithm. There will be ways to challenge it, but they're going to be sort of few and far between and not systemic.
Well, I think one of the ways in which we can help that process is to make sure that governments are required to provide the code or provide the design of the system that's making the decision, so that rather than the individual decision, but providing a way in which that procedure for making decisions becomes legible to the courts or to litigants. And that
transparency is key.
Yeah.
Even courts can comment.
Yeah.
You know, and that can lead to reform.
That's right.
So Minister Shorten is just in the process of joining us now. So I might wrap this session up and thank Paul and Daniel very much for a really fascinating and engaging conversation that I could definitely keep going all day on. So I'm so glad that Economic Justice Australia will be working with Paul in the coming couple of years, looking at social security and automation and how we can draw on the lessons from Robodebt and the automation that's going on right now to improve the system. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Leanne. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.